Hello. Deciding when, where, and if you'll send your child to daycare is not necessarily always an easy decision for parents. Your child's experiences during those impressionable infant and toddler years shape the rest of their life. So every parent wants to ensure that their child is safe and cared for while they're at daycare. So today I'll be just discussing the issue of daycare streaming cameras, whether it's risky or even a problem at all, what can be done, and situating it within a broader conversation about children's privacy rights. So for some parents, being able to watch their child on streaming video live from daycare does help alleviate some of that anxiety. But if you ask any parent group, you will find that opinions are divided. Some parents are acutely aware of the privacy risks inherent to streaming video over the internet, and they won't consider daycare where those cameras are present. And I guess, doesn't that mean that we can let the market decide if parents who want cameras will seek them out and parents who don't will avoid facilities that use them? And I guess sort of, yes, but if we leave aside the risks for now, there are, as any toddler parent can tell you, not enough daycare places to go around in most parts of Canada. When you make it to the top of the wait list, you take this spot. And I guess you could wait and see if something better comes along, but for the most part, it's hard to justify when your parental leave is coming to an end and you just need to have something sorted. So it's basically informed consent, and it's not coerced, it's just there are a lack of options. So you sign the form, you get your login credentials, you agree to protect them. But every system is only as secure as the weakest link. Some parents will be careless with their login credentials, and most daycare facilities don't have a tech guy on staff. They'll rely on the camera provider to make sure that everything was set up properly, or at least that it was initially. And that, it might be fine. All the same, your child's personal information, their picture, their everyday activities, it's being broadcast. It could be recorded. It could be used as AI training data. And it's hard to be sure exactly whether data is being stored securely, especially as companies go under or get acquired and staff come and go. There's a lot of data being collected. It's very deeply personal, and there are no guarantees that it's being stored as securely as it should be. And then surveillance has its own risks too. So the panopticon is, among other things, a metaphor for social control. The idea is that people modify their behavior if they believe they're being watched, regardless of whether or not they actually are being watched. The information panopticon refers to all of the data that we create in our online interactions, including on CCTV, and that could be at daycare. So the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child dates back to 1989, and that committee affirmed in 2021 that the rights of children must be respected, protected, and affirmed in the digital sphere, in part because they can't avoid it. And in order to protect their rights, their parents need to be informed about the risks. And then there's the educators. They're also involved. They spend hours every day with children, and in Canada, there are usually highly educated professionals, and they deserve to use those skills without being surveilled. Those relationships are really formative, and early childhood educators need to be able to sing and dance and be silly without feeling embarrassed or monitored. And then at the heart of this is also the issue of children's autonomy. Children need to be able to develop autonomy in age-appropriate ways, and that includes learning to navigate social relationships, even as a child. And that's inhibited when their parents are watching the daycare stream and can mediate conflicts on their behalf, without the child even knowing that the parent's aware of it. So childcare is a provincial or territorial responsibility, but it's not to say there isn't federal involvement. Not everyone loved the Canada-wide early learning and childcare program, but it did give the federal government an opportunity to engage in standard setting. There were conditions attached to receiving the funding, and that mattered to the provinces and territories because daycare is expensive, whether it's parents bearing the costs or the government. It's not cheap to keep children safe and entertained in a developmentally appropriate way. So in 2012, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada issued a report on surveillance in children, writing that available research has raised legitimate questions about the potentially detrimental effects surveillance may have on children's social development in the long term. And some have posited that growing up with surveillance as a daily presence may even normalize the practice over time and influence a shift in social norms away from privacy. So that was 2012, and I would say those fears have been more than realized as social media became a massive force in children's lives in the years since then. And that created not just more privacy risks, but also a culture of self-surveillance. You have to self-surveil because there's always someone with a camera right there or on CCTV. There's a risk that every embarrassing moment could be memorialized forever, and looking at yourself through a camera all the time like that has negative impacts on your self-esteem. But that's not to say that this doesn't sort of solve a problem. Allowing parents to watch live streamed video of their children playing does sort of, and that's why it's a draw of some, especially expensive childcare facilities. It creates a feeling of transparency and allows parents to feel connected and maybe alleviates their anxiety, although some parents do report that the opposite is true. But it creates the illusion of safety, not safety itself. No camera shows every inch of a daycare. There's limited available guidance, but it does suggest that private areas like bathrooms or changing areas not be filmed. And most daycares don't use cameras that stream sound, so what's filmed can be misleading too. So daycare, as we've said, is regulated at the provincial or territorial level, and it's actually very highly regulated for licensed daycares. Jurisdictions offer comprehensive planning and design guidance for the physical environment. They often recommend CCTV for entrances, but there's virtually no guidance from the province or territories about whether cameras should be used elsewhere and under what conditions. So laws like FIPA, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, or PIPEDA, the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, those apply depending on who exactly runs the daycare center, but they don't capture the unique vulnerabilities of children and sensitivities of their data. The situation isn't that different in other care environments. During the pandemic, it became somewhat of an issue in long-term care, where again, there aren't guidelines, and long-term care facilities were in the media asking very directly for them. Now it's a bit different because long-term care is actually someone's home. You can't tell people that they can't record in their homes. So facilities in that instance were mostly seeking guidance around audio. For instance, in Ontario, you need one party to consent to the conversation. So if the resident's in the room, that's fine. But if they leave and there's like a nurse and a doctor or something having a conversation, then that becomes more of a legal gray area. So the situation is a bit different, but the lack of guidance is the consistent theme there. And then sort of bigger pictures, CCTV is relatively common in schools, and the school boards have a policy about it for the most part. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada notes that schools aren't exactly a public place. So there's a reasonable degree of monitoring that's both desirable and expected because they are that kind of supervised environment. But they still caution against being privacy invasive, and schools are, of course, subject to privacy legislation like FIPA. So there isn't really an interest from stakeholders in a ban. And similarly, jurisdictions have really not used regulation to shape how daycare streaming video is used. It's hard to regulate at the pace of technological change. Israel is the jurisdiction that's had the most success in mandating it. Their law allows for a few different methods of parent viewing. So live streaming is one, but then just a periodic review of recorded footage while on the premises is another. And those arrangements are all voluntary and require the consent of the parents. So that law was passed in the aftermath of some very highly publicized abuse events and was intended to create transparency. But the reality is that it's not protective. It allows for witness and maybe not even accurate witness, given that most systems don't stream audio to accompany the video. Then there are the other harms. So then if we look at what can be done, it's appropriate to remind licensed childcare facilities of their obligations under existing privacy legislation so that they can, if they're not already doing that, obtain signed consent forms from parents and just sort of update them generally. And that's about it for the moment. We need to understand the risks and benefits as perceived by stakeholders, which could include parents, early childhood educators, licensed childcare centers, the companies who sell these devices, young people who've aged out of daycare but still experience surveillance in other settings, and others. And the policymaking environment is difficult right now, and the childcare landscape might change after the federal election. So then we issue interim guidelines or a memorandum to explain the benefits and risks of daycare streaming video and to describe facilities' obligations under existing law. But what we actually need to do is advance the conversation about daycare streaming video and position it within the broader subject of children's digital privacy. So in order to do that, we could establish a commission of inquiry. A commission would be established by the governor and council, by cabinet, in order to fully and impartially investigate an issue of national importance. In this case, the issue that's being investigated is children's privacy rights, and daycare streaming video as a facet of surveillance is just one part of that. So the recommendations of a commission of inquiry are non-binding, but they are tremendously important for agenda setting because of the media attention that a commission draws. As far as daycare streaming video is concerned, you would need a panel of experts and through them to obtain evidence in order to fully understand the risks and benefits, how it can be made safe from an IT perspective, and whether there are developmental impacts. And then as far as children's privacy rights go, we need to understand what the risks are, whether there are risks at all, how and if they can be mitigated. And that includes like other CCTV use in schools and the community, and then more broadly, things like social media, the software that kids need to use in order to attend school and recreation activities, and just sort of generally how much of a child's life interacts with the online sphere with no ability to opt out. And then you would also address digital literacy on the topic for children and parents. So there is a precedent in terms of an emerging technological issue where jurisdiction is not necessarily 100% federal. From 1989 to 1993, there was a Royal Commission on New Reproductive Technologies, and that work shaped the Assisted Human Reproduction Act, which Fareeha mentioned. So this isn't necessarily something that's quick, but I don't really think there is a quick fix option, so you have to be thorough. These are technologies which have very quickly and completely permeated the society before we really understood the impact. So commission is generally led by an expert or a judge, someone who has the authority to take on this kind of endeavor. And I think you also need experts who study early childhood education, children's development, youth mental health, and surveillance and privacy. But you need to consult stakeholders quite broadly, and youth voices in particular need to be considered. Because surveillance has significant impacts on racialized people, you need to take special attention to consult stakeholders who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. Ultimately, children deserve safety, and that includes in online spaces. And as the children of the earliest online influencers start to come of age and share those experiences, we're beginning to see how damaging it can be to grow up under constant surveillance. And then the 2024 Power School hack demonstrated that so much of children's sensitive personal information is insufficiently protected. The information panopticon is massive, and children are just as exposed as adults, mostly without any ability to change or minimize or opt out from that. And then the weakest link in any system is always the human, and you have to understand that it's not just the sheer volume of data which children are forced to share in order to participate in like everyday and not optional activities like their schooling, but also the potential for all those separate sources of data to be combined in the information panopticon, which puts them all at risk. Thank you.